When Mallory called and said he was coming, I didn't have time to object. "I won't stay long, just need a change of scenery," he said. His voice sounded as though the decision was already made, leaving me no choice but to prepare. My stepbrother. How many years had it been since we last saw each other? 5? 6? I wasn't even sure what kind of person he had become, but I still remembered the mischievous boy with the raspy laugh I once couldn't stand. I tried not to dwell on it as I set the table. Dinner was simple: pasta, a light salad, and wine. Just an ordinary family evening. My husband had called to say he'd be working late, so it fell to me to welcome Mallory alone. I deliberately dressed modestly. Home jeans, a cotton shirt. Everything to emphasize that it was just another day, and his visit was nothing more than a minor deviation from routine. When the door swung open, I froze for a moment. Standing before me was someone I didn't recognize. Tall, self-assured, with a casual ease in his appearance. Jeans, a leather jacket, and a bottle of red wine in hand. His smile was wide, slightly mocking, and his gaze... It felt as if he knew something about me that I didn't know myself. "Hey, little sis," he said, pulling me into a hug. His hand lingered on my waist a second longer than it should have. I stiffened, but quickly stepped back, forcing a smile. "Mallory," I said evenly. "Come in." He looked around the house as if he were a critic assessing an exhibition. I noticed how his gaze lingered on the family photos in the hallway. My husband, me, our friends. Too perfect a picture, I read in the smirk on his face. By the time we reached the living room, my husband had come home. He quickly hit it off with Mallory, laughing at his jokes, though I found them sharp, bordering on inappropriate. Mallory told stories from our childhood, most of which I'd rather forget. "Remember how you yelled at me for stealing your diary?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice. By the way, I read it with great interest. You always had a unique perspective on the world. "I was a child back then," I replied coolly, avoiding his gaze. "And now you're completely different, aren't you?" he murmured, just loud enough that my husband wouldn't hear. His words echoed in me strangely, unsettlingly. By the time dinner ended, I felt drained. As I showed Mallory to the guest room, I tried to maintain a polite demeanor, but something inside me had already begun to throb dully. "Good night, little sis," he said at the door, giving me that same look that made me feel both hot and uncomfortable. I didn't reply, just closed the door and went back to my room. Waking up the next day, I made a decision. No matter Mallory's intentions or his manner of communication, I would simply pretend everything was fine. He was a guest, I was the host, and my role was to maintain order in the house, especially for my husband's sake. It was easier to think that the oddities from the night before were just a figment of my imagination. In the kitchen, I tried to focus on making breakfast when I heard his footsteps. It was remarkable how, even in silence, he managed to move in a way that seemed deliberately attention-grabbing. I turned around instinctively, and there he was, standing in the doorway, wearing a t-shirt and jeans, his hair tousled as though he'd just woken up. He looked too casual for a morning visit to my home. "Does it always smell like this here?" he asked, inhaling deeply and nodding toward the fresh flowers on the table. "Or is it you?" I said nothing, focusing instead on the skillet with the omelet. His questions were odd, but I decided to ignore them. He moved closer, and a slight chill ran down my spine as he stopped just behind my shoulder. "You got up earlier than everyone to make breakfast?" he said with a faint smirk. "The perfect wife. And hostess, since you're here," I replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. "Sit down, it's ready." He took a seat at the table, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me. Those eyes, damn them, they seemed to be trying to see more than they should. When my husband joined us at the table, the atmosphere lightened a bit. They laughed again, discussed the news, and seemed to enjoy their conversation. But every time I got up to pour more coffee or clear the dishes, Mallory caught my eye. There was something in those fleeting glances. I was starting to get angry at myself for even noticing it. After breakfast, I tried to focus on chores. Mallory went out to walk in the garden while I busied myself with cleaning. After some time, he came back inside, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Do you always work this much?" he asked, watching me mop the floor. "Someone has to stay busy while the guests entertain themselves," I shot back, hoping he'd take the hint. But of course, he ignored it. Instead of leaving, he moved closer, stopping just near enough that I had to tilt my head to look up at him. "Have you always been like this?" he asked, his voice soft, almost contemplative. "Always so serious, so proper. Makes me wonder what's underneath all that armor." I felt my pulse quicken. He was standing too close, speaking too plainly. "Mallory, maybe you could find something useful to do?" I said sharply, striving to keep my tone calm. "Like taking a break?" He smiled, stepping back. "All right, little sis. Whatever you say." At dinner that evening, the atmosphere was warm, almost cozy. My husband, as usual, sat at the table with a slight weariness from his workday, while Mallory, on the other hand, was relaxed and energetic. His ability to draw attention to himself like a magnet was becoming increasingly evident. "Do you remember when we used to play in Grandma's garden?" Mallory suddenly asked, carefully placing his napkin on his lap. His tone was light, almost casual, but I immediately felt a tension. "You were always so determined. Even when we argued, you wouldn't back down." "Really?" I tried to respond neutrally, but something tightened inside me. "Oh, yes," he chuckled. "Though, that's what I admired about you. Your spirit. It was always clear you were different." I caught his gaze and realized there was something more behind his words. But before I could respond, he added with a slight smile, "Though, as a child, you could afford to be softer. Now you're all grown up, so untouchable." "Untouchable?" my husband interjected, smiling, unaware of the undertones. "That doesn't sound like her at all. She's the most practical and caring person I know." "That's obvious," Mallory replied, looking straight at me. "But often practicality hides something deeper, doesn't it?" I felt anger rising inside me. This conversation seemed harmless to everyone but me. "Mallory," I said, striving to stay calm, though my voice came out colder than I'd expected. "Perhaps it's best if you put an end to these philosophical musings." He smiled wider, leaning forward slightly. "Forgive me if I overstepped. I just couldn't help but notice how much you've changed. But sometimes blood doesn't lie. We're family after all, aren't we? That bond runs deeper than any formalities." I dropped my fork, the clatter ringing out loudly. My husband glanced up, slightly surprised, but said nothing. Mallory, however, calmly raised his glass of wine as though nothing had happened. "It's nice that you see us as close," I replied, forcing the words out. "But some boundaries are worth respecting." This time, my smile held not a trace of friendliness. Mallory acted as though he didn't notice. After dinner, I retreated to the bedroom earlier than usual, leaving my husband and Mallory in the living room. Closing the door behind me, I leaned against it, feeling the anger and unease rising within me. His words, his tone. This wasn't just awkward humor. It was something else. Deeper. More unsettling. I knew that if he continued, I wouldn't be able to simply ignore it. But what could I do? Tell my husband? 'Cause a scene? It all seemed so complicated that I stood there, feeling trapped, cornered by something I couldn't quite name. The morning began peacefully. My husband left for work, and I decided to spend the day tackling small household tasks. Mallory was already up, and I was honestly surprised by his energy. Guests usually prefer to sleep in, but he seemed lively and even offered to help. "Let me make coffee," he said as I came down to the kitchen. "I can't just sit around doing nothing while you're running the place." "Well, if you want to," I replied, trying to sound casual. If he was willing to take on even a small task, it was a welcome change. The coffee was excellent. Mallory joked that in a city cafe, it would cost no less than $5 a cup. We sat at the table in a comfortable silence that he occasionally broke with harmless questions. Are you always this energetic in the mornings? He asked as I started gathering the dirty cups. It's more out of necessity than habit. I smiled, rinsing the dishes. If I don't start the day actively, I won't get anything done later. You're good at it, you know? He leaned his elbows on the table, studying me intently. This house, the atmosphere. You can tell you've poured your heart into it. The words sounded sincere, and I felt a little flustered. Thank you. It means a lot to me, I replied, lowering my gaze to hide a small, shy smile. In the afternoon, I worked in the garden. There was always something to do. Weeding the flower beds, trimming bushes, checking to make sure everything was growing as it should. I thought it would be a good way to distract myself and spend some time alone. But as soon as I brought out the tools, I saw Mallory heading toward me. You're clearly not one to sit still, he said with a light smile. Let me help. Unless, of course, you're afraid to trust a city boy with this. Are you sure you can handle it? I teased, pulling on my gloves. Let's see who gets the upper hand. He shot back, grabbing the pruning shears. The work went quickly. Together, we cleared the flower beds, tidied up several overgrown bushes, and then paused for a short break. Mallory turned out to be a good conversationalist, easygoing, unintrusive. He shared amusing stories about his city, including a tale about neighbors who kept a mini farm on the roof of their building. I laughed a few times, genuinely, forgetting my earlier unease. You know, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Sometimes I envy you. Not the money, not the house, but this stability. It's like you found your place. I froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. His words were flattering, but there was something personal in them. Still, I decided to take it as a compliment. Maybe, but it doesn't come on its own. It takes work, I said, avoiding his gaze. And you work, he said softly, his eyes lingering on me just a second longer than they should have. In that moment, I wanted to believe it was just an act of kindness. We'd spent an ordinary day together, helping each other as friends or relatives do. But deep down, something told me this was more than that. The next day, my husband suggested a family trip to a water park. It was his way of unwinding after a stressful week, and I eagerly agreed. The idea sounded perfect. Mallory was equally enthusiastic, as though the very thought of spending time outdoors, away from the confines of the house, genuinely thrilled him. When we arrived, the scent of chlorinated water and the cheerful shouts of children instantly set a carefree tone. My husband went to buy tickets, leaving me and Mallory to wait at the entrance. I tried to focus on the lively noise around us, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze on my back. Do you like water? He asked suddenly, breaking the silence between us. Yes, it's relaxing, I replied, watching the clear streams cascading from artificial slides. And you? Love it, he said with a faint smile. I remember that time we went down the water slide in Grandma's yard. You pushed me out of the way to go first. I chuckled, the memory surfacing from what felt like another lifetime, when we were kids and life was simpler. We found a spot under a canopy, spread out our towels, and my husband immediately dashed off to try the tall slide, eager to be the first to conquer it. I stayed by the pool with Mallory. Around us, water splashed, children laughed, and the sun warmed everything pleasantly. I began to relax, feeling a bit more at ease. Are you sure you don't want to try the slide? He asked, nodding toward it. I think I'll stick to the pool for now. I smiled. I'm not a fan of extreme activities. Then how about just a swim? He suggested. Just the two of us. I hesitated. There was nothing in his tone that suggested any hidden meaning, but the idea itself stirred a faint unease in me. After all, it was just a pool. All right, I said and walked toward the water. We swam slowly along the edge of the pool, exchanging casual, light-hearted conversation. I felt reasonably comfortable as long as he kept a respectful distance. But at one point, he moved closer. You're graceful in the water, he remarked, stopping nearby. I imagine you're the same in life, able to handle any storm. Somehow I doubt you'd know much about that, I replied, trying to move away. But he followed. I just observe, he said calmly. Sometimes it's fascinating to see what lies beneath your armor. Mallory, you're far too observant, I said, trying to diffuse the moment with humor. Maybe it's time to stop? As you wish. His tone remained light, but his gaze stayed piercing as if still probing. I decided not to give him any reason to prolong the conversation and swam toward the ladder to exit the pool. Even as I climbed out, I could feel his eyes on me, and the sensation stirred a quiet irritation. When I returned to our spot, my husband was back, laughing as he recounted his thrilling experience on the slide. The three of us dove back into the noisy, carefree day, but the tension between Mallory and me felt almost palpable now. This trip to the water park was supposed to be a lighthearted break, but instead, it left me with even more questions. Why did every glance, every word from him provoke such intense feelings in me? On the third day of my reluctant hospitality, my husband came up with a sudden idea. Why don't we all go abroad for the weekend? Just for a couple of days, somewhere by the sea where it's warm and relaxing. His suggestion caught me off guard, but I decided not to argue. Perhaps a change of scenery would help distract me from the unsettling thoughts about Mallory. Early Friday morning, we headed to the airport. Mallory behaved like the perfect travel companion, helping with luggage, joking with my husband, and even ordering me a cappuccino at the cafe before our flight, as if he instinctively knew my favorite drink. His attentiveness was unnerving, but I tried not to dwell on it. A few hours later, we found ourselves on the Italian coast. The soft, salty air enveloped us as soon as we stepped out of the airport. My husband rented a car, and within half an hour, we arrived at a small seaside town with narrow streets, colorful houses, and olive trees drooping so low they nearly touched the road. This is incredible, Mallory exclaimed, gazing at the azure sea that came into view as we turned a corner. You picked the perfect spot, brother. My husband was pleased with himself, and I focused on the scenery. Everything was so beautiful that, for a moment, my worries faded. We settled into a cozy villa overlooking the sea. It was charming, with simple, elegant furniture and large windows through which you could hear the cries of seagulls. After unpacking, my husband suggested a walk along the beach. I slipped into a light dress and sandals, ready for a carefree evening. But as I stepped out of the room, I bumped into Mallory in the hallway. That color suits you, he remarked, his gaze lingering a second too long. Thank you, I replied curtly, trying to brush past him. Are you always this serious? He asked, stepping back to let me through. Relax. We're here to enjoy ourselves. I said nothing, avoiding his gaze, but his words struck a nerve. It felt as though he knew I was trying to maintain control and was testing how much more I could endure. The next day, we went on a tour of the local wine region. The warmth of the sun and the endless vineyards stretching into the horizon lifted my spirits. We sampled local wines, listened to stories about their production, and even took part in a tasting. Everything felt almost perfect, until Mallory approached me while my husband stepped away to take photos of the view. Notice how quiet it is here? He said, almost offhandedly. Yes, it's wonderful, I replied, trying to focus on the scenery. It's like you can't hear yourself, he continued, his voice too soft. You keep pretending you're comfortable. I don't know what you mean, I snapped, turning to face him. Of course you do, he said, his words tinged with challenge. You're just afraid to admit that you like the attention. His words hit like a bolt, and I recoiled, anger and confusion mingling within me. You're crossing the line, I whispered, low enough that my husband wouldn't hear. Maybe, he said with a smile that almost seemed apologetic. But I don't think it's such a bad thing. I wanted to walk away, but his confidence seemed to root me in place. For the first time, I felt his attention was becoming too heavy, too personal. When we returned to the villa, I felt drained. My husband suggested spending the evening on the terrace, watching the sunset. I smiled and agreed, pretending nothing had happened. Mallory joined us too, but now his gaze seemed even more intent, and I felt my resolve weakening. I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend not to notice. The evening was warm and serene. After a packed day, we returned to the villa, tired but content. My husband set glasses on the terrace table and opened a bottle of local wine we had picked up during the excursion. The air carried the salty freshness of the sea, accompanied by the distant sound of waves. "This is the way to live," my husband said, raising his glass. "No rush, just sunsets and good wine." "I'll drink to that." Mallory smiled, settling into the chair next to him. "You really nailed it. This place is perfect." I felt a bit lighter. After the tension of the past few days, this evening promised to be truly relaxing. I quietly took in the view. The sky, painted in shades of orange and pink, blending seamlessly into the sea. "Don't you think time flows differently here?" Mallory suddenly asked, addressing me. "Maybe," I replied, slightly surprised by his casual tone. "It's easy to forget about work and worries here. It's like all of that is far away." "Exactly. It reminds me of a place I visited a couple of years ago," he continued. "The same sea, the same sunsets. Just a less inspiring company than now." "Do you hand out compliments this freely?" I asked, trying to hide my discomfort with a playful tone. "Only when they're deserved," he replied with a faint smile. "You know, you have an incredible sense of style." "What?" I looked at him in confusion. "Your dress. Simple, but just right. Do you always choose things so perfectly?" "I just wear what's comfortable," I said, shrugging, feeling my cheeks heat up. "And yet you look like you stepped out of a magazine," he concluded. My husband laughed. "Now that's what I call attention to detail. I should take notes on how to give compliments like that." "You give the best compliments," I assured my husband, hoping to shift the focus. "Spouses always have each other's backs," Mallory said with a wink. "But honestly, you two look great together. It's harmonious." For a moment, I felt that his remark was entirely sincere. The tension that had lingered between us for the past few days seemed to evaporate. It was just a friendly evening with conversations and light laughter. Even Mallory appeared more at ease, free of his usual, slightly guarded expression. When the sun fully set and the first stars appeared over the sea, we began discussing plans for the next day. My husband wanted to visit the local market for fresh seafood, and I suggested we cook dinner at the villa. "It'll be better than any restaurant," my husband assured me. "You're a master in the kitchen." "We'll see, as long as someone helps peel the shrimp," I joked. "I'll volunteer," Mallory said unexpectedly. "I can't let the two of you do all the work." "Let's hope you know how to handle knives," I teased, feeling a surprising lightness in the exchange. "I know my way around them," he replied with a smile. "You'll see." When we parted for the night, I found myself thinking that for the first time in days, my interactions with Mallory hadn't left a bad aftertaste. Perhaps I'd been overthinking everything. Maybe he was just trying to be polite, and I was reading into things that weren't there. That night, I fell asleep feeling that this day had been good, peaceful, almost happy. The next day, my husband and I went to the market, leaving Mallory to relax at the villa. The Italian market was incredible. The scents of fresh herbs, the gleam of olive oil, and the boisterous voices of vendors offering everything from ripe tomatoes to massive lobsters. My husband was in his element, bargaining with a smile, while I carefully selected ingredients, already imagining how they'd come together in a true Mediterranean dinner later that evening. When we returned to the villa, we found Mallory on the terrace with a book in his hands. He looked relaxed, but his face lit up the moment he saw us. "Did you get everything you wanted?" he asked, glancing at the bulging bags. "Absolutely," my husband said proudly. "Tonight's going to be the best dinner of your life. Guaranteed." With these ingredients, it'd be hard to mess up, I teased as I made my way to the kitchen. Cooking had always been one of my joys, and tonight was no exception. My husband, as promised, helped with the seafood, while Mallory unexpectedly took charge of chopping vegetables. He worked deftly, cracking jokes now and then that made us laugh. The atmosphere felt almost like home, and I noticed how the tension that had built up over the past few days seemed to be fading again. You know, this reminds me of our childhood, Mallory suddenly said, holding a knife. When we used to cook with Mom, you were always there, correcting me if I did something wrong. For a moment, I froze. Those memories felt so distant that I was surprised he even remembered them. Yeah, but most of the time, you just sampled everything while I tried to finish the job, I replied with a small smile. Because you were the perfect hostess even back then, he added quickly. You always knew how to keep things under control. And you always knew how to turn everything into chaos, I shot back, trying to lighten the unexpectedly warm moment. Maybe, he said, looking at me with a quiet smile. But you know, I always liked that about you. His words caught me off guard. I noticed my husband glance at us but say nothing. Mallory quickly shifted the conversation to another topic, and the moment of tension vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Dinner was flawless. We sat on the candlelit terrace, sipping glasses of chilled white wine. My husband shared funny stories from work, and Mallory listened with genuine interest, occasionally adding his own quips. I watched them and found myself marveling at how one evening could feel so warm despite the undercurrents I couldn't quite ignore. You did a fantastic job, Mallory said suddenly as I placed a plate of fragrant pasta on the table. This dinner is restaurant level. Thank you, I replied with a smile, trying not to show how much his compliment unsettled me. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than I'd have liked, but my husband didn't seem to notice. As the evening wound down and we finished the wine, Mallory spoke again. You know, I envy you too, he said. The way you're together, it's rare. His words sounded sincere, and for a brief moment I felt a pang of pity for him. It's not magic, my husband replied with a smile. It's work. Sometimes hard work, but it's worth it. I looked at my husband and felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe it was moments like these that kept us together through everything. As I lay in bed that night, I felt, for the first time in days, that there was a kind of truce between Mallory and me. His behavior had been more restrained, and I wondered if he was simply seeking the kind of human connection that's hard to find. Or maybe, once again, I was overanalyzing. For now, it didn't matter. The day had been good. Calm, warm, and comforting. And that was enough. When we returned home from the trip, everything fell back into its usual rhythm. The familiar routine, everyday tasks, and small household chores. I was relieved to return to normalcy. The trip had gone better than I expected, and I hoped that all the strange tensions involving Mallory were left behind. While my husband unpacked and caught up on work emails, I decided to tackle the laundry. There was plenty to handle: beach towels, clothes, and other items that needed freshening up. But as soon as I opened the washing machine, I noticed the lid wouldn't close properly. Something plastic was jammed inside. With a quiet sigh, I knelt down to investigate. The issue wasn't simple. A piece of plastic had lodged itself between the drum and the machine's casing. I reached deeper, trying to free it, but to my embarrassment, I got stuck. The tight space between the washing machine and the wall left me trapped. Great, I muttered, feeling my face heat with frustration. That's when I heard footsteps. Mallory. Of course it had to be him. Everything all right? He asked, appearing in the doorway, watching me with an amused smile. No, I replied curtly, still struggling to free my hand. Mallory, help me, please. He stepped closer, clearly enjoying the situation. His gaze lingered on me, and I felt even more vulnerable. You're stuck? He asked, barely suppressing a laugh. Yes, I snapped, exasperated. Just help me, all right? He knelt down to assess the situation, his face uncomfortably close to mine. The small laundry room felt even smaller. Mallory gently tugged on my hand to help free it, but he paused for a moment, his eyes meeting mine. His expression shifted, becoming serious, almost tender. You're so stubborn, he whispered, still holding my hand. It suits you. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, he leaned in and kissed me. It was so sudden that I didn't immediately comprehend what was happening. I instinctively tried to push him away, but for a moment I froze. Shocked, overwhelmed by a chaotic mix of anger, embarrassment, and confusion. And then the door opened. My husband stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on us, frozen in place. That moment stretched into eternity. Mallory didn't even attempt to explain. He slowly stood up and stepped back, his expression calm, almost indifferent. My thoughts raced, a storm of panic and disbelief swirling inside me. What's going on here? My husband's voice was cold, cutting through the air like a blade. It's not what you think, I began, but my words came out weak, unconvincing. Mallory shrugged, as if none of it mattered to him. I think I'll be going, he said casually, and the absurdity of his detached response made the moment feel even more surreal. His figure disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a heavy silence. My husband didn't wait to hear my stammered attempts to explain. He turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, rooted to the spot, the unresolved jam in the washing machine now the least of my concerns. All I could feel was the bitter weight of realization that everything in my life was starting to fall apart. After that scene, my husband refused to speak to me. He avoided me, moving through the house like a ghost, dismissing my attempts to talk with a curt and cold, "I need time." But time only seemed to deepen the tension between us. Mallory packed his things and left the next day. He didn't even say goodbye. I heard the door close and the hum of his car engine, and inside me, there was a clash of relief and an inexplicable sense of loss. He was gone, leaving chaos in his wake. But I couldn't deny that there had been something about his presence that I now missed. Maybe it was the attention, or perhaps his audacious confidence that shattered every established norm. My husband, on the other hand, grew more distant. We barely spoke, sharing a bedroom but separated by an invisible wall of unspoken words. One evening, when I tried to approach him, he simply said, "I can't forget it. I can't even look at you without thinking about what I saw." It was a mistake. I stood before him, my voice trembling. I don't know how it happened, but it meant nothing. You're my family. You're everything to me. He looked at me, weary and drained. Are you sure about that? Because from where I stood, it looked like it meant something. Those words drained the strength from me. I had nothing to say because he had seen it happen, and I knew I bore responsibility for that moment. Even if I hadn't wanted it, even if it had been against my will, I had allowed it to happen. The next day, he packed a bag and left. "I need to think," he said, not even looking at me as he spoke. I was left alone in an empty house, surrounded by reminders of the life we had built together. A life I had unraveled. I tried to analyze how things had come to this point. Had I truly been happy in our marriage? Or had Mallory simply been the catalyst for something that had been brewing for a long time? From the moment he arrived, I felt my sense of balance collapsing. He challenged the identity I had constructed for myself, and perhaps that made me question whether I had been honest with myself all along. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea, staring into the void. My mind swirled with thoughts. What now? Could I fix this? Did I even want to? A few days later, I decided to text my husband. A simple message. "I'm sorry. If you're ready to talk, I'm ready to explain." He didn't reply immediately, but the next day he wrote back, "I need more time. I'll let you know." I realized that the future wasn't solely up to him. I needed to figure out why I had let my life veer so far off course. Maybe I needed this upheaval to understand that ignoring my feelings, no matter how uncomfortable or frightening they were, was unsustainable. For now, I was alone. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like the right place to begin again. Weeks passed after my husband left. The house, once filled with the familiar sounds of our life together, now felt hollow. I was getting used to the silence, though at first it had been unbearable. Over time, I realized I needed this solitude to process not just what had happened recently, but everything about my life. I spent more time in the garden, clearing overgrown flower beds and replanting flowers. It became a kind of meditation for me. Each weed pulled, each new bloom planted reminded me that I could bring order back to my life if I chose to, both in my mind and in my surroundings. One evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the doorbell rang. I froze for a moment, half hoping it was my husband. But when I opened the door, Mallory was standing there. He looked different, calmer, more serious. The confident smirk he often wore was almost absent. "Can I come in?" he asked, holding a bottle of wine. I nodded, uncertain of what to expect. We sat in the kitchen. He opened the wine and poured us each a glass. He spoke first. "I'm not here to justify myself," he began, "but I need to tell you that none of this was planned." "Mallory," I interrupted, "let's be clear. What happened was a mistake. It destroyed my family. And I still don't understand why you did it." "Because I was lost," he said, staring into his glass. "I came here feeling like I needed to change something in my life. I wanted to see you, see your life, and figure out what I was missing. And it turned out I was missing you." His words were both painfully sincere and unbearably heavy. I stared at him, trying to muster the strength not to give in to anger or pity. "But that doesn't give you the right to cross my boundaries," I said firmly. "You didn't just harm my marriage, you broke my trust. And I need time to figure out how I even let this happen." He nodded in quiet agreement. "I understand. I just wanted you to know. I'm leaving. I won't interfere in your life anymore. But if you ever feel like talking, you know where to find me." With that, he left, leaving me alone once again. But this time, the solitude felt different. Not like a punishment, but like a chance. The next day, I texted my husband. "I'm ready to meet if you want to talk," I wrote. It was a short message without any expectations, but with the resolve to let him have his say. His response came quickly. "Let's meet tomorrow." When we met, I saw that he too had changed during this time. He seemed calmer, though the pain was still visible in his eyes. "Why?" he asked, his first and only question. "Because I was lost," I admitted. "Because I let someone else's words and actions stir something inside me that I didn't fully understand. But that's not an excuse. It's something I need to work on." He was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "I'm not sure I can forget this, but I still love you. And maybe if we're both willing to fight for us, we have a chance." His words felt like a ray of light in the darkness. I didn't know if we could make it work, but I was ready to try.